I hope you can hear me all right. Welcome. As Matt said, I'm Hadass. This is David. I'm not going to do many introductions. You can look up our bios online if you're really interested. Just a quick note, we will be taking questions on Slido. So please use your app, ask questions. Those I find are often better questions than what I could ever come up with. So counting on all of you to impress us, pretty much. But I want to get started here. So David and I actually did another event about 6 months or so ago. And you told me there that by March, you would be approaching the end of your 3-year strategy and that you guys would be breaking even. So.
Did I say that?
Have you broken even?
Well, look, it's not quite the 31st of March yet. So there was a 3-year strategy that started when Kath Viner got her job in June 15, and I became chief executive in July 15. And we did embark on this this incredibly sort of brave and innovative and bold sort of strategy that took a whole number of different elements, but one was definitely about financial sustainability. And we said that we'd break even by the end of March, and given that's a couple of weeks away, I'm sure we will get there, but you're going to know I'm going to be quite cautious to say we will be there by the 31st of March, but every number indicates that we will be there, yes.
So that's pretty confident, but
pretty confident.
We'll be seeing you on the streets, selling extra newspapers to try to make
I will do anything to get break even, I promise you.
Okay, I'm going to count you on that. I'm calling you on March 31st. Yeah. So what's the strategy for the next 3 years for the garden? You've obviously gone through a huge kind of shift. There's now the sort of the donation, membership ask, whatever you might want to call it, that everybody sees at the bottom. That's become a huge part of your revenue. Is that the future of the Guardian's funding in the future?
Look, I think it won't be any great surprise to anyone in this room is that the only real thing that the Guardian does or actually cares about is the sustaining its newsroom. It is all about the journalism, and in the end, the remit of a chief executive and the trust and the board is to protect the Guardian in perpetuity, which is an awful long time. And perhaps when we get on to some of the digital startups that are struggling within their first 5 years, we've been at this for nearly 200 years. And that ultimately, so there's something in our success criteria, however much it might have been up and down in terms of financial sustainability or digital relevance or global footprint, in the end, it is always about the journalism. So to answer the specific question, it will start with our journalism, it always will. And we have to find equitable ways to be able to do what we do to the largest audience possible and as many different countries and as global as we can be to be able to make a purposeful impact. And as long as we're making a purposeful impact and as long as we're sustaining as many journalists we can afford, then that is the answer to what The Guardian should be for the next 3 to 5 years. Now, what we have taught ourselves in the last 3, 4 years is that one cannot be complacent. I have built-in corporate paranoia about the things that you can't quite see coming around the corner. I've talked publicly about my inability to even forecast a year, let alone a quarter, such as the disruption and potential opportunity. And so I think that what are the themes that you will probably look to for the next 3 to 5 years? We will be and will continue to be very dependent on our readers. They will definitely build and engage deeper relationships with our readers as well as drive purposeful reach. And then obviously we will try and navigate our way through the opportunities and the disruption of advertising and also embrace technology. And I'm sure we'll talk about technology, but there is a positive impact in The Guardian. The Guardian went from a sort of a regional newspaper to a national newspaper, then went from the 9th largest newspaper out of 10 to one of the biggest in the world, and that has been as a result of the impact of technology. So that will play a role.
We will definitely talk about technology in just a minute, but first I want to ask you, as you alluded to, it's been a tough few months for the media industry. There's been several rounds of layoffs. We've seen places like Vice, New York Media, BuzzFeed, really been affected by this. As a CEO of a competitor, when you look at what happened there, what do you think went wrong?
Well, look, I think if you stand back, and I'm sure people in this room are sort of connected or part of or observe some of those organisations, and and this is not a personal judgment, I don't want to see any business particularly fail, but I think if you look back at the likes of BuzzFeed or indeed Vice or Vox, a lot of these businesses are backed by private equity. There's a huge amount of rhetoric that associates itself with those companies to say these are the businesses that are going to answer the problem. You know, there is this legacy pool of publishers, perhaps The Guardian might be within that description, who are going to struggle to get there. And actually it is these new entrants who are going to be more agile, all these cliches, more nimble. They understand data, they understand the millennial consumer, and as a result of it, this perfect proposition is somehow going to survive. And actually the world is not like that. There are a number of different criteria, a number of different inputs that makes a company successful. And, you know, I suppose when you look, and I look at those companies where I think there was a figure of 2,500 people lost their jobs just this year from January to the end of February, just from those three companies. And what does that tell you? It tells you there still remains a huge amount of disruption. It shows you that this sort of nirvana view that one company can solve everything. You know, that BuzzFeed at one point was considered to be the darling of virality. Then there's an algorithmic change of Facebook, and then suddenly you look at that and say, well, actually, will that work? Or Vice, who did an extraordinary job to create $1 billion company, and then suddenly the tone and the output of their journalism perhaps has not chimed quite with the times that we're in, and suddenly that's not necessarily wanted anymore. And so all organisations have to face into, and as like I was saying earlier, is this the ability to be self-aware, to be able to adapt very quickly. And I always, you know, it's like people celebrating us getting to break even. I think that's the point when companies should probably be at their most paranoid, actually. The idea that you should complacently sit there and say, we're breaking even, everything's going to be fine. That is the time when perhaps the sense of urgency, the sense of the beginning, to, you know, the idea of change really quickly might begin to slow down because you think you've got there. And a lot of the companies that have faced problems in the last 6 months perhaps started to believe their own hype. Some of these valuations were citing some of these companies worth billions and billions of pounds. And perhaps a team then who's strived hard from a start-up to something of scale might get complacent at that point. And you've just got to be really, really self-aware of things that can hit you.
Have you ever given this advice to Jonah Peretti or the leaders of any of these companies directly?
Well, I think all of us, I think any leader or anyone in any organisation just needs to just be constantly thinking about. I'm always looking at the downside, always.
That sounds pessimistic.
And it is, and I think, well, when you know, The Guardian 3-4 years ago was on the, you know, got itself into a pretty perilous state, and to think that the company that is so special and so important to so many readers around the world, in 2015 was, you know, potentially losing 100 million of cash and nearly 90 million at EBITDA level. Those things really can destabilise and, if not permanently, put you out of business. And you just got to be really careful.
So, have you had direct conversations with Jonah Peretti or any of those?
No, I have not had. Who am I to advise anyone on those sorts of things? I think it's just about the world that we live in. But
as you noted, Guardian had its own difficulties, laid off some, I think, 500 jobs or so.
Yeah, we closed down, 450 roles. Yeah.
Are there more of those sorts of changes coming? Do you feel stable now? And then also, when you make those cuts, where did you make them, and where are you now hiring to go forward?
3 years ago, I suppose one was there was a sense of urgency just on cost base, and you know, we said that we would take 20%. We would reduce our cost base by 20%. That's equated to nearly £50 million. A combination of redundancies and closing down roles. It was between 450, 500 roles, and that again is an awful experience to go through, particularly when the company is so purposeful, and anyone who joins The Guardian is there to, you know, support its important mission. So that was a horribly difficult process. And all we did say is that, consistent with our values and behaviours, that we will treat people with the most respect with regard to that. In terms of the makeup of the organisation now, I suppose this is always the challenge, is that, actually, just go back to the first part of your question, is, you know, how would I describe The Guardian now? I think, you know, it might not sound the most optimistic summary, but we are out of danger. I think that we were in danger. We were in a spot of bother, and I think now you could describe us as out of danger, being able to just pause for a minute, and Kath Viner, our editor-in-chief, and I can just pause and reflect for a second about, you know, what does this organisation need to be now that you've removed that cultural impact of danger, because I think that can impact the way in which you start to think about the future. And now I think the trade-offs are, you know, we have to find ways of thinking about how we grow global reach and global impact, as well as build deepening relationships with our readers and how we can make readers make a greater contribution. And in order to do that, we need to be where our readers are. And so there are fantastic opportunities in podcast. There's these sort of I'm always wary of these sort of themes that come along, but people are talking about ear rather than eye. And some of the multiples now that you see in the podcast world are actually beginning to look really interesting compared to video, which I think was overcooked in terms of price. And so there's great opportunity there. And then I think we will just continue to think about data infrastructure, video production, still digital storytelling to drive engagement.
You talked about getting to the readers and the viewers where they are. Part of where they are is also, I would say, local news. We've seen a huge decrease in the amount of local news. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal, I think today, that said that Facebook wants to surface more local news and they just cannot find enough. Do you think The Guardian does enough local news? And not just, Guardian's known for the big stories, the Cambridge Analyticas, Edward Snowden, all that. What about the local council, the school board, things like that?
Ultimately, that's a decision for Kath, our editor, in terms of where we should be editorially. But I think there's just a practical decision to make: is that we're a national news brand, we are a global news brand, and that ultimately will impact on the trade-offs between sort of national stories versus regional. I think Kath, when she was on stage yesterday, talked about the only way really to get under the skin of the things such as Brexit, of where I think we had a very early indication of where potentially that referendum was going, because we had journalists within regional towns and cities who were talking about a very disenfranchised audience, who were very, very aggrieved by the way that Westminster seemed to be controlling everything. And I think by putting people in those regional pockets, it means you have a little bit more connectivity to how people feel. There's just a challenge about how much you can replicate that in different markets, or indeed, as I say, trade-off between national stories and regional ones. But I think given the way culture is set up at the moment and the fragmentation of it, I think you've got to have regional understanding to really understand what's going on. Right,
but can also local news pay? I can see why podcasts with stories about Cambridge Analytica could pay.
Yeah, I think everyone in this room will see that the structural challenges and the commercial challenges of regional news has been absolutely brutal. And I was talking to someone in the States recently, and they were trying to aggregate up the number of regional newspapers that are collapsed within the US, and it was it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands. So it's a desperate position in terms of regional news.
So I wanted to get more into sort of these different new ways of how you're connecting to your readers. You referenced podcast briefly. I think it was just a few months ago, Guardian launched a 25-minute daily news podcast.
Yep.
How is that going? You said you think video is a little bit overbaked. How do you know that podcasts aren't also something everybody's just jumping into and it's just going to blow up in their faces?
And isn't it strange about how sort of technology works? Is that the term podcasts, which I'm not aware if I'm overclaiming it, whether I think the Guardian coined that phrase, but it's been around for ages, and then suddenly, whether it be through screen fatigue or whether how much more can we consume, it is evident that podcasts and ear has allowed us to just reflect for a minute and pause. And I don't know how your media consumption is changing, but I seem to have managed to find 24 minutes to be able to now take on board Today in Focus, which is our new daily podcast. And we did look at the Daily, which is the New York Times equivalent, and it's been phenomenally successful. And I think screen fatigue and the relentlessness of breaking news and always being sort of on the forefront of what's happening within the second has actually started to create consumers and readers just to sort of back off and say, look, I can't possibly deal with this second-by-second updates. And so our Today in Focus just allows us to be able to take a topic, allowed to sort of do a deep dive into the things that really matter behind that story. And, my only personal thing is I find myself walking further to a tube station now rather than the nearest one, just so I can just spend a little bit time listening and reflecting to the stories rather than just chasing the headlines. And Today in Focus is now regularly within the top 5 of news podcasts. The accumulation of downloads I can't mention, but it's exceeded all of our expectations. And I suppose looking at the sophistication of our reader journey, how do we optimise anonymous reach, regularity and propensity to contribute? We know that the podcast will play a role in deepening engagement.
Will you ever charge for the podcast?
No.
Why not?
Well, I think that at the moment, creating friction between us and our journalism is something that we have shied away from. You know, when we started this journey three years ago, the only two bits of advice Kath and I were given was just cut the costs and put the paywall up. And we said we will never say never, but we said the paywall would be on the table if at some situation it needed to be explored, and we haven't had to go there. At the moment, we've got 650,000 reoccurring paying relationships every month, and that's a combination of app and digital subscription, print subscription, and then reoccurring paying relationships of people who are paying for something that's actually free. How profound is that people are so committed to The Guardian, they'll pay for something that's actually accessible to all. And we believe that there's a long way to go on that contributions model. So at the moment, we do have, the premium app is a paid for product, and I'm sure there will be more products, but charging in a brutal sort of friction way is not something that's currently in consideration. I think we've got a long way to go on the power of reader contribution.
The New York Times has had some success with its offshoots, like the cooking app and the crossword specials, things like that. Do you see The Guardian getting into anything like that anytime soon?
Well, look, I think rather than those specifics, I think now that the Guardian is very focused and we have the capability, we talk about reader journeys, which traditionally would be described as an audience funnel in any other organisation. We've got a huge amount of sophistication in how we manage our data. All of those insights are informing us to be able to create new value for our readers. And it starts with how can we create more value for our readers. And so rather than saying we will copy or replicate what the New York Times has done, I think it is inevitable in the next 3 to 5 years that we will create increased products and services for our readers. Some may be charged for, some maybe not.
What about newsletters? We've seen some media companies really dig into newsletters and see that as their future. I know The Guardian has several newsletters, but it doesn't seem to be something that you're very focused on. Do you see a future in that?
Email in general is an incredibly powerful tool. The open rates on our emails, particularly from our journalists, are phenomenal. And we are going through quite a detailed process to be able to plot the role of email, whether it be from our reader revenue team or whether it be from certain news desks, and the power of those emails ultimately to encourage conversion. And at the moment, they were newsletters, as you say, which was just sort of deeper analysis behind a story. Now I think that we can still provide that service, but I do think that we could use them in a slightly more strategic way to encourage either a one-off contribution, a reoccurring one, or drive subscriptions.
What about advertising in newsletters? Do you see that as a sustainable business model? I'm thinking Axios has done this.
Yes, and I think that in the end, it is always about our journalism. It is always about giving the best journalism to our readers. And, advertising is critically important to the business models today. And going forward, it will always have a main and critical part of our business model going forward. Just have to be careful about where advertising appears and its disruption. And we know all of the sites around the world that sort of has almost got 3 times more ad load than we have. All sorts of expandables and banners and buttons, and in the end you have to sort of hunt the journalism. There's only so much of that we would ever do.
So let's talk about a fun subject: social media. Obviously been a lot in the news recently. You described your relationship with Facebook as it's complicated. Why is that? Have you had any recent conversations with them that have changed that? What is it like to be in the room with them?
Look, if I'm sounding sort of rather repetitive on this subject, so I'm sorry if you've heard me say this before, but look, the relationship with Facebook is incredibly complicated. And I think if you stand back and just see the business models that we're in, like we are in the business of creating purposeful, value-based, quality journalism of which has a sense of moral compass. That's what we do. And what we do is, the best we can, is monetize that through advertising, through reader contributions and subscription models. So let's write that as a sort of single paragraph. And then to the side of that, let's think about the business model that Facebook are in, which is essentially the vast distribution of virality with no sense of responsibility about what sits on the platform. No real business model that returns or gives any equitable value back to the creator. And so essentially, what does that platform do? It has been hugely successful of aggregating huge, vast amounts of data and allows advertisers and brands to be able to target people around the aggregation of a huge amount of content of which they have no responsibility for, and they have all the tools to be able to put those two things together. So you put those two pieces of paper next to each other and then you have a meeting. You're trying to work out where is the opportunity for collaboration. And based on those two premises of what we both do, it is very, very hard to find commonality. Cambridge Analytica is obviously something that has, I actually genuinely believe, did have a profound impact on Facebook. I do think it did actually create the disruption that we needed it to do. And I think when Mark Zuckerberg is in front of the Senate, or he's looking at share value beginning to collapse because of the lack of understanding about how data was being used, I think it shows the power of a tiny company relatively can have on that company. And what do we do? I think we were saying earlier is that as a chief executive of a legacy media company, I hate the term, but let's just assume we are a legacy media. You can sound as if these tech platforms, it's all unfair and they've taken our money, and it's not really about that. Is that the Guardian holds these organisations to account as we would do any organisation. And then I think just from a business person, whenever I meet anyone from Facebook, is you just want to say, look, with scale and impact in the world comes responsibility. And I think that responsibility about what they do has come very, very late.
But do you think they've reached that understanding?
Yes, I do think that there is...
Genuinely, or their lip service?
I think that they do now have a clearer understanding of the unintended consequences of the success of that platform. And I do think that they understand that when they say, hey, we're just a platform, we connect people. Well, you can connect good people and you can connect bad people. And at the moment, the idea that somehow a platform can connect people and you have no real arbitration or no real sense of responsibility about connecting the bad as well as the good, you end up with the resulting circumstances that we're in now. And these businesses are new. They're, compared to our 200-year-old history, these businesses are very, very, they're very small in their tenure. However, I think they should have got to their sense of responsibility far sooner.
Obviously, we've been having all these conversations surrounding the New Zealand shooting and the live streaming on Facebook. You mentioned earlier that The Guardian chose not to show a single clip or image of that video. Walk us through that sort of decision-making, but also whether you think that this incident will shift in a dramatic way, maybe even more so than Cambridge Analytica, the way that governments see to regulate these social media companies.
Look, I mean, obviously, it's the horror of what happened in New Zealand always makes people pause and reflect of what happens in society, particularly the role of technology. It is a shame, and it's really disappointing that you need something of such horror to make people now start to talk about the role of these technology companies. And, I think we have to be a little bit careful about sort of blame and responsibility. I don't think we can, the idea of acute blame is something that one has to be careful, but there is a profound sense of responsibility when these things happen. And it is really difficult for an organisation such as ours, who can look at an advertiser in the eye or talk to our readers and say, that type of content has no role within our ecosystem, it will not be distributed across any platforms. And the idea that somehow, accidentally or otherwise, someone should monetize that is abhorrent. I mean, Kath and I and the organisation would not even allow any of that to even touch our building. Whereas you then get these companies of such scale and such resources with huge amounts of money, seemingly unable to be able to create the technology and the tools to be able to stop that from happening. It's just deeply disappointing. And the idea is like we're getting to that, or we're on that, we're trying harder, we must do this. I just don't think it's good enough.
Do you think that governments will be able to successfully regulate these social media companies? Do you trust the UK government? They have a white paper coming out soon on this.
Well, whether trust and capability. I wouldn't judge on the trust. Do they have the capability? I think the jury's out. I think this is incredibly difficult to understand when you've got such monopolistic behaviour from two huge organisations that have, over the last, let's say decade, have demonstrated such power and influence about the distribution of advertising, the lack of responsibility for brand safety, the distribution of images and video, which is impacting people's lives, particularly young people. You know, how this rap sheet, how long does it need to be before government intervention starts to take hold? The challenge is the capability of doing that. You know, where will that responsibility preside? And I don't want to sort of excuse government in terms of their interventions, but this is complicated stuff. But I do think now it is no longer something we need to get to. I think it's just really urgent.
But could the regulation that's being considered also affect you and your business? And is it not, as you said earlier, a lot of times they say, oh, the Karen Cross Review, we have to do this to save local news. Should the government be getting involved in trying to help the news industry?
What I was deeply reassured by around Cairncross is that as a review, it wasn't there ultimately to say it is our job or government's job to solve the business models of news organisations. You know, we're proud people. We don't need someone sort of fretting over that. What I do think we do need to do and give consideration to, which Cairncross did, is what is the societal impact without strong independent news being able to tell people the stories that matter. And the fundamental brief to Cairncross was saying, if this duopoly continues to take that much share, if the advertising trading mechanisms don't allow the money to go to the originators, i.e. the content producers, there is a danger within the next 5 to 20 years there won't be a news ecosystem. And what Cairncross was there to do was to evaluate what are the things that could ultimately challenge an open democratic society with not having news in it. And I think that was ultimately the exam question. And then the outputs of that, one considerable one and one important one, which we absolutely agree with, is a CMA review on the way in which advertising is traded. And that's been, you know, that should have been done some time ago, and we really welcome that.
When it comes, though, to the government regulating things like online harms coming forward, are you not concerned about somehow the effect on free speech, that then the government will be trying to be the arbiters of what's true, what's good, and what's not?
I think before we get into the vagarisms of, look, we have a plural media world of where there are diverse voices from the Guardian to the Daily Mail, and you know, the society is good for that polarising kind of ecosystem of varying views. I think any intervention from government has got a long list of things to do before they start convening with sort of the freedom of speech. If you think about, you know, the images of self-harm and all those, you know, terrible content that is distributed, I think there's a long list of things that need to get solved before they get to the impact of freedom of speech.
How has your coverage of the Cambridge Analytica scandal affected your relationship with Facebook?
Well, it makes it interesting. I think I think that they know who we are, which is important. I think that, you know, that there are people who probably fear that phone call. Hi, it's X from The Guardian. Could you comment on? And we like that. And, you know, there's never a truer example of what The Guardian's role is in the world. And, you know, we've had the conversations with very senior people within Facebook about the implications of that and how indeed the company responded when we first approached them with those stories. It shouldn't just be down to a relatively, compared to these companies, small news organisations to hold them to account, as I said. There needs to be much more powerful bodies to be able to do that. Now, we are, and I have said this, look, there are some fantastically talented people within Facebook who, you know, who don't go to work to do all the negative things that sometimes those companies are known for. But some of this stuff just needs to get fixed and solved.
Okay, let's get some Slido questions we've got coming in here. Who else in news do you admire?
Look, I think a sort of a more generic question is one mustn't underestimate what it means to be in editorial generally. I mean, I think, you know, your role, I mean, any journalist right now has the ability to be able to tell stories to as many people as possible around the world through multiple distribution channels of Facebook and Instagram and any technical way of distributing content. The trouble is the fatigue that I think that any journalists go through right now is that these stories never seem to end. And I admire any committed journalist who is there digging out a story, grinding out a story that takes 12, 24 months to be able to ultimately reveal a Windrush or whether it's a Cambridge Analytica. And I have massive admiration for those stories. But I do worry about, in the end, the relentlessness of all of this and how we encourage people just to look after themselves, because it's a pretty scary time. And I think some of this is pretty addictive, to always just be on the front of that story, which people cannot switch off from.
So do you tell Carol to sometimes take a vacation?
It's not for me to say that, but I think of all people in our organisation who have worked so tirelessly over the last 3 years to get to this important break even, you do need to have time to reflect. I say that to myself as well, which I'm really bad at. But
Let's see. One question that fell off the Slido that I wanted to ask is about consolidation in the news, or consolidation in media. I've seen a lot of that happen recently, especially when it comes to television. Do you see that? I mean, my company was just bought by AT&T. Do you see more of that coming?
Yeah, there's a phrase of sort of, competing is expensive and collaborating, partnering is cheaper. And so therefore, I do think there is on the wider global scale massive amounts of consolidation. One, because they are having to sort of arm up and prepare for Netflix as it is today and what it will be for tomorrow. And who knows where Apple or Google might go within the content distribution space. So you can see the consolidation required just to be able to create the muscle to be able to compete with some of the things that potentially will come down the track. On a much lesser scale, we've created some consolidation here, whereby ourselves, News UK, The Telegraph, and Trinity are consolidating around how we sell advertising. Mm-hmm. We've got our project Ozone, where we're looking to amalgamate some of our data sets and bring together our combined reach of 42 million people, and there hopefully make it easier to be able to buy in a very sort of seamless but trusted way. And so I think there is opportunities for collaboration, whether it be strategic around sales or whether it be on a much grander scale of companies merging. Now, one of the challenges and both the opportunities for The Guardian is that we'll always be independent. And that has some benefits because we have a trust and we have a board, we don't have a proprietor, we don't have shareholders, so we can play it very, very long. But we don't enjoy some of the synergies that other organisations have. News UK is part of News Corp, and therefore there is inevitable synergies that help those companies do what they do. We don't have that, which does put a lot of pressure on us as a company.
Do you think, and are you fearful of an Apple or a Netflix getting into the news business themselves beyond just being a distributor?
Yeah, I'm always fearful of those. Because I don't quite know what that means. I mean, sort of, Apple. They've had Apple News. There've been attempts to be able to pull those and aggregate content streams together, and then you suddenly get the Apple tax, and then the programmatic advertising doesn't quite work, and so you get no money. And so we haven't ever. It's amazing when you deal with those platforms. They always come in and say, "We've got the answer." Whether it be instant articles, or whether it be Apple News, or whether it be initiative from Google, and you always sit there and say, okay, let's just play this out. And to date, there's never so far been anything what I'd describe as material.
So what's worked, it seems, has been people know The Guardian, so they go to The Guardian, and that's what works.
Look, in the end, we have this phenomenal brand that's been built up over 200 years, where it doesn't matter where you go in the world, you'll always find Guardian readers who have such a profound understanding about what we stand for. And ultimately, destination is really important. And I've sat sometimes with, a technologist will say, look, David, in the end, destination is dead. It's all about sort of the open web, and that serves technology. But the idea that you put a cross through destination and just leave yourself exposed to the virality of social media means you've just lost your sense of place. And if you don't have a place, then I think you don't have the opportunity to monetize readers or indeed make an advertising case.
Another question we have is, which UK quality, I wonder what the definition of quality here is, news brand do you consider to be your biggest competition, and what do you think that they're doing well that you are not?
I slightly struggle with that.
You think you're that good?
Well, I think we're very, very good at what we do. I really, really do. And I say that because we've got the proof points of just the most recent stories. And I do, I think the Times has had fantastic stories. I think that the Telegraph continue to be able to push on certain agendas. But I think in the end, what it's not to say that those organisations are not purposeful. I think what makes The Guardian incredibly unique is its independence and its fearlessness in terms of how it takes on some of these very impactful and important stories. All news organisations, and there are some fantastic editors in other companies, are doing the same. It's just that I do think The Guardian has quite a unique place, and I don't say that from a place of arrogance. I just think we're really special, and our readership and our constant, our value scores as it relates to trust and how big we are around the world creates a space which is quite unique.
Okay, but name one news brand that you see as your biggest competition.
No, I won't.
That's not allowed.
Look, the BBC is, I think the BBC is an extraordinary organisation. I think it has a very unique and very privileged funding model, which sometimes I envy. But, that is a very, very important news organisation. And obviously there are some times when you worry about how their reach and impact starts to impact our ability to be able to do our job. But I would admire the BBC.
Okay. What keeps you up at night then? What are you most worried about when it comes to The Guardian's future?
Yeah, there's been a few sleepless nights, I would say, through this. The advertising market, it's a sad thing to say that I'm at home and I worry about the advertising market and programmatic. That would be quite sad. But I do worry about it. I worry, I'm someone who has been, I've run an ad agency and I've been a marketing director. And so I was sort of brought up through the school of sort of building brand equity and creating value for your customer. And I sort of look at the landscape at the moment and just the constant optimization and it's almost beating consumers around the head for that short-term tactical sale. And I think that The Guardian is set up to create a premium environment with the trusted quality, and you want that to ultimately be a space that can build value over time. And what I worry about is whether you sound naive now, whether it's all ultimately just about conversion. And somehow I might sound like a dinosaur to say that you do ultimately consumers go to brands that they trust and they have empathy with. And I'm just not sure I've seen any strategy from any brand for some time that talks about building empathy with its consumers. I do know how they know how to optimize, but I think there's a reason why a lot of the FMCG companies over time are struggling with margin. And that is the biggest tectonic challenge of all the holding companies, because there's such an absence of margin from these big companies, is that we've just been monetizing right at the bottom of the funnel. And quite what will change that, I'm not sure.
Should news in the future only be nonprofit? Should it be funded by trust? Should we get away from the idea that news should make money?
It's a really, really good question. And look, in the end, as we said right at the beginning of this, is that what is the purpose of The Guardian, and what is my job to do is to be able to make sure that we can fund the largest newsroom we can possibly afford to make the biggest impact. And the jury is out on whether that is a profitable ambition. And so, The Guardian doesn't have debt. We don't have any pension deficit. We run a very large endowment. We have a ventures fund, and all of that kind of economic ecosystem is there to sustain the journalism. And though I would obviously want profit and seek profit, in the end, if The Guardian can sustain itself within the framework of its endowment and its investments and our ventures fund, then that's fine. That's fine, and that is a real gift. I don't have a shareholder saying, deliver, 10 million, 20 million, 50 million of profit next year. We do have a shareholder, however, and a trust who wants us to be sustainable. And thankfully, at the end of March, we're in sight of doing that.
So is your model, you think, the future for other news organizations?
I think, look, if you think of who are the people that we look around the world and sort of scrutinise and admire, I mean, the Washington Post say it's profitable, but we can't quite work out those numbers, and it just happens to be backed by the richest man on earth. And so that's helpful. Then you get the New York Times, which, again, is a phenomenal organisation. And over the last few years, they have absolutely nailed their processes and their reader journeys to be able to optimise for a paywall, and are profitable. However, we've always said is that you don't look to the New York Times for the answer. It's a very unique organisation, happened to be housed in the richest island on earth, and therefore trying to use that as a proxy for profitable news organisations is you have to be careful of. So I think that I think to do what we do in a profitable way is a challenge in the medium term.
Well, the clock tells me we're in the red, so that's the end of our time here. Thank you all for joining us. David, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Have a good rest of your week.